All right. So this will be Aristotle's summary of logic, which is, you don't hear it called that way by anyone else. At least I've never heard it said like that. That his work called The Topics, Book 1, is simply a summary without the technicality of the previous books. And the books prior to The Topics are both of the analytics, posterior and prior analytics, the interpretations, and the categories. What's traditionally thought of as logic, or what scholars long ago had called the organon, was comprised of those 4 works, The Topics, and then the addendum to The Topics, which is Sophistical Refutations. Now, in the time of when Aristotle's works were translated from Greek, then into Syriac, and then into Arabic, they called logic, they included 8 works in logic, and also had the rhetoric and the poetics, in addition to Sophistical Refutations. So anyhow, the organon, the main guts of logic are those 6 works. I call them 5 works because analytics, really, Aristotle never refers to the analytics as being broken up into 2 different works. And when scholars did break them up, and they rearranged them incorrectly. So when you go through the organon, it goes categories, interpretations, then it goes prior analytics. No, yeah, then it goes prior analytics, then posterior analytics, then topics. So they've got that backwards. Posterior analytics, mostly concerned with induction, comes first, and then prior analytics, mostly concerned with deduction, is next. And Aristotle gets into that at great length in the topics. So let's just go ahead and do the topics. Our present endeavor proposes to find a line of inquiry whereby we shall be able to reason from reputable opinions about any argument presented to us, and also shall ourselves, when putting forward an argument, avoid saying anything contrary to it, for no contrary is the first principle of all principles. First, then, we should say what deduction is and what its varieties are, in order to grasp dialectical deduction, for this is the object of our search in the work before us. A deduction is an argument in which certain things being laid down, something other than these necessarily comes about through them. It is a demonstration if the premises from which the deduction starts are true and primitive. The subject matter is in hand, greeting, and admitted by our senses. And the argument is dialectical if the subject is only in a matter of speech, dialect. It is not available to be admitted by our senses, but instead is emitted by what someone says, their opinion. Things are true and primitive, which are convincing on the strength, not of anything else, but of themselves. For in regards to the first principles, proof by our senses, it is improper to ask for the why and wherefore of them. Each first principle commands belief in and by itself. First principles are not proven, they are the proof. However, as the eyes of bats are to the blaze of day, so is the reason in our soul to the things which are by nature most evident of all: substance, quality, and relation, or relation. Now, opinions are reputable, which are accepted by everyone, or by the majority, or by the wise. Next then, we should say, for how many and for what purposes this endeavor is useful. There are 4: intellectual training, casual encounters, studying art, and understanding science. It is useful as a training, since the possession of a plan of inquiry will enable us more easily to argue about any subject proposed. As for casual encounters, when we have counted up the opinions held by most people, we shall meet them on the grounds not of anyone else's convictions, but of their own, shifting the ground of any argument which they appear to us to be saying without a leg to stand on. As for studying the arts, the ability to puzzle on both sides of a subject will make us more easily detect the truth and error of the many points that arise. And lastly, it is of further use in regards to the proof used in science. For it is impossible to have any discussion about them at all from the principles which are proper to any particular science, seeing that the principles themselves are true and primitive, and there is nothing prior to that which is true and primitive. And therefore, inductions must be made first, and then it is through reputable opinions about them that the sciences have to be discussed. And this discussion, departing from opinion and arriving at principle, is the task of dialectic. Dialectic is a process of analysis, wherein lies the path to the first principles of all inquiries. And so let us examine this process of analysis and the materials with which arguments start. Now, the materials with which arguments start are equal in number and identical with the subjects on which deductions take place. All arguments start with a proposition, but the subjects on which arguments take place, or deductions take place, are problems. A proposition is simply an assertion or a proposal saying something about something. But a problem turns the phrasing of that statement into a question and asks if what is being asserted or proposed true or false? Is it or is it not? We seek the fact, the reason why, if it is, and what it is. And therefore, dialectical deduction begins with a proposition and through interrogation drills down to arrive at what is true and primitive, thereby either proving the proposition, if it is in harmony with first principles, or refuting the proposition if it is contrary with first principles. For with a true view, the facts all harmonize, but with the false one, they soon clash. Now, there are 4 elements that belong to these materials. For every proposition, and therefore every problem, indicates either a genus, a property, or an accidental. However, since of what is proper to anything, part signifies its essence while part does not, let us divide the proper into both of these parts and call that part which signifies the essence of a thing the what it is of what is it, a definition, and refer to the remainder as we already have, a variation of the word proper, a property. And an accidental is let's say it this way. But do not let anyone suppose us to mean that by each of these four elements, a definition, a genus, a property, and an accidental, that either of them, enunciated by itself, constitutes a proposition or a problem, but that it is only from these to which propositions and problems are presented. And so let us say what each of these are. A definition is a phrase signifying the essence of a thing. Again, the what is it of what it is. It is rendered in the presentation of a phrase instead of a name. Now, arguments about definitions are mainly concerned with sameness and difference. For if we can argue that two things are either the same or are different, then we shall be well supplied by the same turn of argument with lines of attack against their definitions as well. For if we can show that two things are not the same, then we shall have demolished the definition and thereby refuted the proposition. Now, a property is that which does not signify the essence of a thing, but yet belongs to that thing alone, and is predicated convertibly of it. For example, it is a property of a human to be capable of learning grammar. And if it is capable of learning grammar, then it is a human. Now, a genus is what is predicated in what a thing is of a number of things. Exhibiting differences, but differences in kind. We should treat as predicates all such things which are appropriate to answer and reply to the question, what is the object in question, or what is it? For example, what is a human? What is a butterfly? They are animals. The human or the butterfly being the specific kind of animal, the species of the genus. General, specific. And of course, an accidental may or may not belong to the subject. Now, having distinguished these four elements as lines of attack towards definition demolition, remember, the most certain way to refute an argument or a proposition is to simply overthrow the definition. often a line of inquiry along the argument of the genus or the property or the accidental is a means of getting at the correct or incorrect definition. And so we should also distinguish the predicated categories of these elements. And there are 10. They are substance, quantity, quality, relation, place, time, position, state, activity, and passivity. Each of these 4 elements, definition, genus, property, or an accidental, will always be predicated by at least one of these categories. Such then and so many are the subjects on which arguments take place and the materials from which they start. Now, of arguments, there are only 2 species, and we have named them already. They are deduction and induction, starting with the particulars and going to the universal, from the specific to the general, all that stuff, right? And deduction, we're starting at an opinion, right? All opinions contain or are composed of universals, right? So we're starting the opinions of the universal, and we're deducing back to what is true and primitive, the individuals, the particulars from which the opinions of the universals were induced in the first place. Now, deduction is prior analytics, right? And induction is mostly posterior analytics. Now, both of those works indicate in which direction the argument is going, right? From the universal to the particulars, from the particulars to the universals. That's it. There's no other direction. those are the only 2, like he says, species of arguments, and he's got the characteristic of each is the direction in which they are moving. So induction is passage, a passage from the particulars to the universal, right? And deduction is departing from the universal and arriving at what is true and primitive. So posterior analytics, what does that mean? So posterior analytics means that it is, so if we're going to say what a thing is, we can also identify what its end is, what its nature is. So the nature of posterior analytics is to arrive at the universal. So what is the universal? Where are we starting from? In order to arrive at the universal, we're starting at the particulars, what's true and primitive. So posterior analytics, the universal, is posterior to. It's after what is true and primitive. And conversely, the same with prior analytics. We're beginning with our universals. We're beginning with our opinions, with our hypotheses, with our theses, whatever you want to call them, with our reputable opinions, our commonplaces, right? In Greek, topic means commonplace. We're starting there, and the end to which we want to arrive is what is true and primitive. So, so if we're already starting with our commonplace or our universals, then what is prior to that, the end of where we're going, is to what is true and primitive. We're not talking about anything being prior to what greets our senses. We're not talking about anything being prior to first principles. There is nothing before that which is always, right? And we're not talking about anything being posterior to what greets our senses. All of that is a kind of academic error to be thinking that we're talking about something prior to existence or after existence, right? After all, existence is eternal. So another way to look at this is talking about existence, and where Aristotle proves and concludes that nature is eternal is in the physics, right? So the physics literally means, or translated from Greek, means nature. Physics in Greek means nature. So that's what's natural, right? And so what's the contrary to what is natural? We would say the contrary of natural is artificial, right? So when we're talking about induction, posterior analytics, it's an art. And when we're talking about deduction, prior analytics, it is a science, okay? So all induction is art, all deduction is science. So art, simply, you can think of it as being an abbreviation or the root word to the word artificial. So what do we mean by that? Well, if we're talking about art naming the universal, well, here's the best statement that Aristotle has to say about it, and it's probably one of the most important statements of Aristotle, all the works of Aristotle, right? There's over 100,000 Becker lines. It's a lot of material. So it's at the beginning of First Philosophy, and he says that art arises when from many notions gained by experience, one universal judgment about similar objects is produced, right? So it's through our experience with the particulars that we induce and create, we craft a universal. So the universal is in the particulars, and through analysis, through this capacity of the human mind, we craft a symbol for it, either by the spoken word, written word, or we can craft another object of sense. Now, everything in nature, all these particulars are objects of sense. They are natural objects of sense. But once it is crafted by a human, then we call it an artificial object of sense, right? Or you could say the other words that are related are artifact, right? And artifice, right? These things have had the human touch laid upon them at some time. And then that's how we get to what's natural versus artificial. And we could also say that the human species is the only animal that acts in between what is natural and what is artificial, right? Because everything that's artificial is the result of human interaction. So this crafting of the universal, the symbol for what is in the similar particulars as a word or symbol, then we can also take that word or symbol and try to objectify it or craft an object of sense as a statue, a novel, a painting, what we would call a work of art, right? So that's how art, work of art, it's all artificial, but it comes from after crafting the universal, right? So we've got this universal of, say, love, right? So then someone wants to craft a painting, or they want to try to concretize that universal into an object of sense, an artificial one, and that's how you might get some objects of art that are supposed to represent that, and so on with every other universal you can think of. And likewise, also artifacts, artificial works of art are tools, right? So it doesn't have to be simply something that captures your imagination, so to speak, or your, epitomizes or signifies what that universal represents by seeing a work of art. But also a work of art is also just a bicycle, or a hammer, that sort of thing. Doesn't have to be something that necessarily, what is the word for it? Is leisurely versus necessary. There we go. Something useful versus something that kind of sparks the imagination, grabs a hold of your senses in that respect. So anyhow, so that's the difference there between those two species. And I did want to say, draw your attention to the naming of the prior analytics and posterior analytics, induction and deduction. All induction is art. And this is what Aristotle is talking about in the topics there. That in book 1, that in order to have a deduction. In order to even do any science, you have to have induction first. You have to have an opinion about what it is before you, right? So any scientist, you know, they want to know, we have a visitor. They want to know why something happens, right? So they'll take, they'll make a hypothesis. And then through deductions, they'll have to prove it. So he's got a helmet cam and a doggy. There you go. Good job.
Not that bad.
Have you ever gone down the other side?
You hit a rock there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the dog took it well.
Yeah, he puts up with it.
Yeah, that's pretty funny. There's separate rapids on each side. All right, so anyhow, to go back, what I was saying at the beginning, that book one is all a summary of logic. So let's just review what we just talked about there. And it goes quite quickly, right? Of course, those are just my favorite passages out of the topics, book one. It's not the whole thing, and it's basically, you know, I like to say it's introductory for the novice and summary for the expert. So that was... So let's just review that quickly, what we just did as a summary of logic. So we mentioned the categories, right? There are 10 categories. And we're saying that the categories are assertions, right? Literally translated Greek, category means assertion, right? And so this is, it's either in the categories or in interpretations where we're talking about combination, right? We don't just say rock, right? We say, we say, sunny rock, right? Wet rock, hot rock, big rock, you know, hard rock, all that kind of stuff. It's always a combination of something and something. It's never just one word. That's the universal when we're finally naming something. But if we're going to assert something, we're saying something about something, right? And that's what a proposition is. We're always proposing something. Well, we don't just propose one word. Even if we just proposed a word like, say, justice, we couldn't just say justice. We'd have to say what justice is, and we would make an assertion that justice always involves a kind of equality, right? So justice, equality, and then you can your proposition would be, you know, is justice always? Is it an absolute equality, or can there be a proportional equality, right? That sort of thing, and then you would go into equals of what? What is on both sides of the balance? What is it that's being equalized? And that sort of thing. You wouldn't just say the universal. So the proposition has to say something about something. That's what the categories is all about, right? So, you know, if we're going to say the rock, or let's use a tree instead. So the tree would say, what kind of substance is it? Well, it's made of wood, and it's hardwood, right? We could say it's hardwood. Well, let's not do it that way. Let's just say substance is wood, right? And if we're saying quantity, well, we're in a forest, and we could say there's hundreds or thousands of trees, right? We could say quality of tree. Well, we could say the quality of these trees is that they are healthy, right? I don't see any dead leaves at the top or anything, or some scaled bark or anything like that. These trees look healthy. That's their quality. What's next? Relation. Well, we could say this tree relative to that tree. One is tall, one is small, or shorter, or little, or that sort of thing. That's relational. What else do we have next? Place, right? So these trees are in this place. This forest is here. So these are all, I'm just going through all the categories, right? An example of each one. So that's place. And we could say time. Of course, it's You might not be able to tell from the film, but I know, and there's plenty of these that are starting, right? We're in autumn. We're after summer, and we are not obviously in winter yet. All these deciduous trees still have their leaves on them, so that is time. We could also say these trees at this time of day get a certain sort of light, right? So that's time. And then we could also, that would also kind of go nicely into the next one, which is position, right? So these trees are positioned to face the sun at this time of day, right? Or the tree is positioned, you know, some trees are positioned closer to the water versus some being further away. And, you know, if you're talking about certain trees that lean towards the water, like a sycamore tree or something like that, that would be its position related to the water, you know, that kind of a thing. Or we could say that these trees are in an upright position because they're tall trees and they're going straight to the sun directly out of the sky. Or we could say the smaller trees are in an overhanging position because they're trying to get out over the creek so that they can get more light and then go up. That kind of thing is positional. So then there's three more, right? So there's state, activity, and passivity. So the state of the tree would be that, now, so there's two different states that Aristotle talks about. One is in the Topics, and the other is in, must be Ethics. So when we talk about the state of a thing, we're talking about its being, right? And usually a state is how it comes to be after it's undergone some sort of activity of its own, you know, some sort of growth, something like that. So we could say that the state of these trees is that they are mature, right? These larger ones, their state is not that they're seedlings any longer or saplings or even just a seed themselves, but they are mature trees. We would say that that's their state. And then the other state that he talks about is saying that a tree, or saying that a thing is of having. We call it, you know, if you wanted to put it in quotes and then a hyphen in between it, it'd be of having. So these trees are of having their leaves. That's the state that they're in right now. They have their leaves. That sort of a thing. You know, especially, you know, the deciduous trees. And in a few months, they will be of having no leaves. That would be the state that they're in, if they've lost their leaves. So, and then the last two are activity and passivity. So the tree itself, we could say that the one tree is acting on another tree because it's leaning to try to get to the light and it's pushing on it. It's acting. And we could say that the other tree is the recipient of that leaning is passive. It's not doing anything about it. It's just being acted upon. It's passive. So those are your 10 categories with a tree as an example. So also we talked about grammar in the Topics, book 1, the summary that I did there. Because we're talking about subjects, we're talking about what happens. So what I was saying was interpretations is all about grammar, right? It's basically a grammar lessons, and even the very first sentence of interpretation, he says first we must name what a sentence is and define its elements, or say what its elements are, and then he goes on to define, you know, subject, predicate, verb, and all that stuff. So, you know, so we've got assertions, we're saying something about something, and then we have grammar. We need to be able to communicate it, not only to someone else, but first to ourselves, right? So language, you got to be able to speak to yourself before you can speak to someone else, and that sort of thing, or vice versa. You couldn't possibly speak to someone else if you couldn't think to yourself without speaking, and all that stuff. That's the importance of words, language, and grammar. So that's interpretations. And then the next ones are analytics, and that's what I regard as the core of logic, is the analytics. And that's where we're talking about the species of argumentation, induction and deduction. So we did that too, we covered that. And then in the Topics, we're talking about specifically dialectical deductions, so that in prior analytics, he's actually talking about it could be a scientific deduction, right, where you have your induction first, and you're saying something about something, and as a scientist or as someone who's studying nature, without having to argue with another person, you're basically arguing to yourself. So you have a hypothesis, and you would deduce down to what's true and primitive. Now the dialectics is a little bit different, because now we are talking about arguing with other people. And when we're speaking or arguing or having a discussion with other people, often an argument can become what's called contentious, right? And not that it's a lot of animosity involved, but there's just maybe, let's just keep it soft and say that there's some disbelief on the part of the other party. And they won't be as agreeable with you, and they won't be as agreeable with you on purpose. So that's a good segue into book 8 of the topics. There's 8 books to the topics, right? So book 1 is just a summary of what's about to happen, and book 8 is actually starts to line up the questions, and it tells you how to let's put it this way. So the very opening line of the topics is, our present endeavor proposes to find a line of inquiry whereby we shall be able to reason from reputable opinions about any argument presented to us. So book 8 is the constructing of that line of inquiry, right? So we're saying inquiry, so it's all about questions. And he says, so he says there's 3 kinds of questions that you want to do, or there's 3, how do you say, variances of what's related to this, and that is, first of all, you want to identify your line of attack from which you're going to base your questions, right? And then you want to organize and arrange your questions and know them yourself prior to proposing or having someone to present those questions to. So that's the 3 things. You got to have your line of attack. You got to know your arrangement of the questions and why you're going to order them in what way and what your questions are going to be. That's the most important thing. And then finally, you have to actually present them to someone else, right? And then along those same lines, there are 4 of the propositions to which we arrive at what questions. So we're asking questions so we can get to our proposition, and then we can deduce down to a conclusion by going through what is true and primitive. You say, aha, that kind of a thing. So of the kinds of ways to get to the proposition, he says that there are 4 necessary, he calls them necessary, I don't know why he said it that way, but the 4 most used or most common ways are, we want to inductively get to our universal from which our premise starts, right? So part of the questioning there, and to get to the proposition, we want to use induction to establish the universal from which the premise of the proposition is going to be deduced from. And then the next line of the next type there is that the proposition is going to offer more weight to your argument, and the next one is that's going to make your argument more clear, and the last one is that it might actually work to conceal the conclusion of your argument. And as we mentioned a moment ago, when we're dealing with people, there might be just as people might be resisting, contentious to your line of argument, you might want to try to conceal the conclusion so that they don't really get to it right away. Because if you put up your conclusion immediately, just like a bumper sticker, there's no deductive reasoning. There's no leading them to the conclusion and to why you get to that conclusion, right? Now that kind of stuff, that would be a demonstrative deduction or scientific deduction. If you already have your conclusion, you don't need to do all the deduction if you're working just by yourself. But if you want to explain it to someone else and try to lead to how you get to that conclusion, then the idea is to start with propositions and lines of questioning. So that's the summary of logic is book 1, the actual arrangement of the questions, and more drill down on the usage of the materials and the elements and the species of arguments into actually arranging your questions. That's book 8. Now what happens at 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, it's a drill down on each of those elements. Book 6 specifically is all about definitions. And definitions are, like I said before, are super important. That's we're going to say something about something, right? But we got to know what it is that we're saying the something about. We got to have a good definition of both somethings so that the arguers are on the same page. And often an argument can be remedied, a disparity between those who are arguing can be remedied, and agreement can become about once they both are using the same definitions, that sort of thing. So a definition, just because it's so important, we always say that a definition contains two things. It contains the genus, and it contains what makes that species different from all other similar things in that genus. So for example, we say that we used a human and animal, right? So animal being the genus and human being a species of that genus. So what differentiates the human animal from other animals? So we say that humans are the rational animal, right? So right there, that's a great definition. You've got both terms in only two words. So the genus of a human is that it's an animal, and what makes it different from all the other animals is that it is rational, right? So it's good to keep that in mind, that definitions are always concerned with two things. And definitions is my own little thing here. Definitions, they don't come from a dictionary. That's where they end up, right? And that's why often you'll find definitions in the dictionary that might not really be well constructed. Let's leave it at that. So, so those other books, they drill down on genus, they drill down on definition, property, and accidental. I think two of those books actually do work on the genus no more. For some reason, it goes into another book. But anyhow, that's the whole topics there. And then what I'll do next is I really want to do. So he doesn't really use explicit examples of using that methodology that he explains in the topics. And I think that's more of what goes on in rhetoric. He's got great examples in the rhetoric, and I'll be doing that one next. At least I want to do that one next. And just the very opening of the rhetoric is that he says that rhetoric and dialectics pretty much go hand in hand. Oh, I did want to say this. That was my twist. He says that, so when I say he says, I don't read Greek. I don't have the original material. I'm going off of what other translators have said. And my favorite translation, the only translation that I would recommend to anyone, is the one done by Jonathan Barnes. It's the Oxford English revised edition of the complete works of Aristotle. I think it comes out in like 1986. It takes Barnes maybe 7 or 8 years to edit and do. And in that actual edition, he includes his own translation of posterior analytics. And I've said this before, it is superior to the 1925 Geoffrey Muir version of the analytics. I do not recommend you looking at the Muir version, but rather go straight to the 1976 version of posterior analytics by Jonathan Barnes. So, so where was I going with that? At the end of the topics, he says that dialectics, not the end of it, at the beginning of the summary in book 1, he says that dialectics is a process of criticism, whereby the path to all inquiries, to the principles of all inquiries. And I have changed that word from from criticism to analytics. So very rarely, if at all, can I find Aristotle referring to the word critical, or criticism in any of the complete works of Aristotle. But he refers to analytics a lot. And if we're familiar with the analytics, which we are, the analytics is all about induction and deduction. And that's exactly what he's talking about in the topics, right? And he's referring to the crux of the analytics as that methodology. So the dialectics, that it's a criticism, I don't see that. And I went over this before in a different video. Criticism kind of makes it sound like you're head to head with someone, going fist to fist with them, and you're being really. It's almost antagonistic. Whereas being analytic, it seems a little more friendly, and just syntax-wise, it makes more sense with what Aristotle's already been talking about in the analytics, and the fact that the topics mentions the analytics, and that it mentions that it's mostly about deduction. And let's say this as well. that Aristotle invented deduction, right? And he invents it because people didn't have a defense against the Sophists, right? They were using rhetoric, and they were using rhetoric in order to confuse people and in order to gain money from them at any cost, is another way of putting it. But from Aristotle's point of view, the rhetoricians, people didn't have a good defense against them. So Aristotle invents the deductive method of how to go back to start with an opinion and get back to the true and the primitive, right? And in Sophistical Refutations, towards the end of it, he goes on in a long passage about that, about why that prior to him there was no other methodology, and then he pretty much invented it. And so if we're talking about logic and deduction being the crux of logic, but again, you can't have deduction without induction. So, you know, they're really tightly put together, which is why Aristotle, seems to me, always refers to the analytics. He never really calls out prior or posterior anywhere that I'm aware of. I guess that about covers it.